Thanks a lot for having me here today. It's a real pleasure to be here. I am Jennifer Jenkins, the Chief Sustainability Officer of NCX. NCX stands for Natural Capital Exchange, and we're a company dedicated to excellence and rigor in forest carbon offsets and natural capital solutions. We're a small company in the forest tech space, and we're built on the team's decades of experience in satellite remote sensing and field measurements in forestry to accurately quantify forest characteristics like species composition and forest carbon. NCX is in the middle of a push to expand and grow in response to the huge need in this critical decade for a scaled up version of the voluntary carbon market. And I'm here today to talk about the role of forest carbon offsets in climate mitigation. And the slide you've all seen, but I didn't include here, is the slide of the Keeling curve, which is the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere, right? The steady increase in CO2 since the Industrial Revolution to the present day, and we do seem to reach an all-time high, every year in that atmospheric CO2. So this slide from the IPCC's recent Work Group 1 report shows the impact of that warming, which is the thing we experience and are already experiencing. It's the steady increase in temperature that is unprecedented in more than 2,000 years and is clearly attributable to human activity rather than to natural effects alone. And so, what are we going to do about it? Well, countries are acting, and certainly international meetings like the COP happening next month in Glasgow are key events. But what this shows is that we're going to have to increase our global ambition in order to limit warming to 1.5 degrees C or even to 2 degrees Celsius. The ambitions, what you can see here is that the ambitions laid out so far for emissions reductions by countries to 2030, and even the most recent ambitions, which are described in May of this year, are enough right now. The pledges that have been made will get us to just under 3 degrees Celsius. But if we're going to actually bend the curve down, following that green line and the green shading there, we're going to have to do quite a bit more. And countries are going to need to step up their ambition. Right? You can see the emissions gap there on the right. So going a little bit deeper and looking out a little bit longer, we know we're going to actually need negative emissions in order to achieve net zero, which is what scientists tell us will be required by 2050 in order to mitigate the worst impacts of climate change. So this graph follows the data from the IPCC Working Group 1 report, which you can see there, was published in August of 2021. Again, what it shows is how far the emissions curve needs to bend, but it also shows that beyond 2030, we're going to need negative emissions in order to get to net zero. And this is because we're not going to be able to mitigate all of the emissions from fossil fuels. There are some sectors and some processes that really do require or, that are going to be very, very hard to mitigate. And so we will need technologies that actually take CO2 out of the atmosphere. And that's what negative emissions are, is the removal of CO2 from the atmosphere. There are a number of technologies that do this, but the most cost-effective today and the most readily available source of negative emissions are from nature. And so natural climate solutions is what people refer to as the negative emissions from natural systems. Really, it refers to the fact that forests and agricultural systems can take carbon out of the atmosphere and store it in the ecosystem, typically in soils or in live biomass. And this is a really effective way to reduce greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. And in fact, researchers have found that natural climate solutions can provide over 1/3 of the cost-effective climate mitigation that will be needed between now and 2030 to stabilize warming and bring it down below 2 degrees C. And so this graph comes from the paper authored by Griscom et al. In 2017, which is one of the first and most important papers to really describe the potential of natural climate solutions to remove carbon from the atmosphere. Well, how do we leverage the potential for carbon offsets and natural climate solutions to reduce greenhouse gases in the atmosphere? Right now, the voluntary carbon market is the place where these offsets are developed and transacted. Important work is underway right now to scale up the voluntary carbon market to meet the demand. And so this is a graph from McKinsey, which has suggested that the voluntary market needs to scale 15 times by 2030 and up to 100 times by 2050. And so this projection of demand from McKinsey is based on a survey of corporate buyers that McKinsey conducted over the last year. So when we think about, of the total need projected by McKinsey, 7 to 13 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year by 2050, forests can provide about 7.3 gigatons going forward per year, right? And that's a huge part of the puzzle, as long as we can do it correctly and find high quality carbon offsets that do provide additional benefit in terms of climate impact. And that's not going to be easy, right? There's been a lot of press lately about the quality of forest carbon offsets. People say offsets don't provide additional carbon benefit because the people who are getting paid to store carbon in their forests were not going to harvest. So maybe they were getting paid through the carbon market for doing something that they were planning to do anyway. Or, people also say the projects that store carbon for a long period of time might, they're supposed to be permanent, but they end up getting damaged by fire. Or that if we choose to leave one forest alone, then another neighboring forest might be cut twice as much to compensate. And so the net effect of the carbon project might be washed out due to that phenomenon called leakage. And so all of these things are issues with the way forest carbon has been done in the past. And at NCX, we've worked hard to develop methodologies that minimize the impact of these important concerns around additionality, permanence, and leakage. So let's just take a look here at the NCX program versus the more traditional carbon offset programs, side by side here. So in terms of additionality, one of the major criticisms we've heard about traditional forest carbon programs is their approach to additionality. When you have a regional baseline, a coarse regional baseline that might be developed from regional averages, and if that gets baked into the program rules, then you might be in a forest adjacent to that region, adjacent to another forest, but but forests differ a lot from each other, and so you might take advantage of some of those regional rules. What NCX does is we use a data at the acre level resolution to assign a harvest likelihood to each parcel based on prevailing economic and acre by acre very specific forest stand conditions. In terms of permanence, traditional carbon projects do seek to store carbon on the stump for decades and sometimes up to 100 years. And this was originally intended to ensure that climate impact was real and measurable and long term. But the problem is that it's hard to get landowners to agree to a permanent set aside. Very few landowners are willing to lock up their land for that length of time. And so it's been difficult to scale the traditional offset market, especially with landowners who weren't already planning to conserve their forests. There might also be the risk of reversal through fire or other natural disturbances. And so that necessitated in traditional markets the use of complicated mechanisms like insurance or buffer pools. So NCX's approach requires the landowner to agree to just a 1-year deferral of a planned harvest. So it's easier to get landowners interested, and the risk of reversal is virtually eliminated. The payment NCX model is also a pay for performance. So the landowner receives compensation at the end of the project period on delivery of the carbon after 1 year, rather than at the beginning of a 100-year project, which is more typical for the traditional market. In terms of leakage, standard projects will use just a base leakage deduction factor, and NCX's approach handles leakage using robust and peer-reviewed methods that I'll describe in the next couple of slides. So let's go through each one of these things in detail. First, additionality, and describe, permanence and leakage, describing how NCX handles each one. So on the right-hand side of this graph, you see the carbon impact of a 1-year harvest deferral, right? So in the baseline would be a standard typical harvested working forest. In the management activity, which is essentially a no harvest scenario, you're going to increase the carbon stored on the stump above what it would have been in the business as usual situation. So by letting forests remain intact, we essentially increase the overall age of the average forest on that landscape. And this leads to increased removal from the atmosphere of carbon dioxide and increased carbon stocks in forests. Well, how do we know? whether that forest would have been harvested in that year. In other words, how do we know we're not just paying a landowner to do what they would have done anyway? We have a method to assess additionality using acre by acre data on current forest economic conditions and timber quality that helps us to assess each individual landowner's likelihood of harvest. And this way we can target the acres that are most at risk in order to maximize the climate impact. And standard offset protocols do follow, as I mentioned before, a long-term model where you pay up front, you store 1 ton of carbon on the landscape for 100 years, and that's intended to ensure a 100-year impact. This model has shortcomings, as I described before. It's hard to get people interested, and there's the risk of reversal. So our 1-year approach actually is based on some scientific literature that shows that many tons stored on the landscape for 1 year has the same climate impact as one ton stored for 100 years. And so the added benefit of this is that we're acting now, storing more carbon now, removing more carbon from the atmosphere in this critical decade when it will make the most difference. And we're also not requiring our landowners to make a 100-year commitment, which actually makes it much accessible and easier to scale the impact of our program. In terms of leakage, activity shifting leakage occurs when one landowner shifts an activity from one part of their land to another in response to some sort of behavior. In order to respond to that, our program actually requires that landowners enroll their entire holding in our program. So activity shifting leakage is minimized. And then market shifting leakage occurs when one landowner's activity actually influences landowner's activity. Well, one landowner inside the project and their activity influences the activity or causes another landowner outside the project to change their behavior, sometimes can sort of negate the overall impact of the project itself. And in the NCX approach, rather than use standard deductions, as I mentioned before, for accounting for leakage, we actually use a conservative deduction methodology that was recommended by leaders in the field and is published in the peer-reviewed literature. So the NCX history has been since 2019 and 2020, we did a pilot project together with Microsoft and their AI for Earth program. And it targeted 68,000 acres and sequestered or avoided 7,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalent. Since we launched our larger scale programs in 2021, we have enrolled 13.3 million acres in the program and also avoided or reduced from the atmosphere 500,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalent. So we've had a tremendous impact, and our next program will begin in January of 22, and we're enrolling landowners now. And that's it. Would welcome your comments and queries and any feedback you have for us. Just go ahead and write to me at the email below. Thank you.